Hello and welcome to Conf42Cast, another exciting episode. My name is Miko Pawlikowski, and today with me is Feeney, the CCO at TerminusDB. Hello, Luke.
Hey,
How are you doing?
I'm fantastic. Thanks a lot for having me, Miko. It's great to be here.
Fantastic. I'll take fantastic. Fantastic is in short supply, so I'll take as much as I can. All right. So to confuse you first, as we do to all of our guests, a weird question. What's your favorite galaxy?
My favorite galaxy. Okay, so I'm a big fan of the Ian M. Banks culture novels, which are kind of, sci-fi on a grand space scale. And it's all about, artificially intelligent ships who talk to each other. But in one of those, there's these kind of lizard guys who at one point kind of get in big war with the culture. And they all go to Andromeda and end up in Andromeda, and they're incredibly long-lived. So I'll go for Andromeda. I also like it because it's going to crash into the Milky Way in a few billion years and kind of destroy everything. So that, what's not to like in a galaxy that's going to crash into another one and destroy everything?
And that's probably the best answer I've had so far to that question. Yeah, the impending doom in a few billion years, something to look forward to. Exciting stuff. All right. That's a good start. So one of the things that I don't usually see when I talk to tech people is being a diplomat for last, 15 years? Well, previously for like 14, 15 years from my, mental maths on your LinkedIn profile. So I'm hoping we can talk a little bit about that. I'm really curious how that affected your journey and, what made you jump to begin with. And in general, you've been to quite a few places. So more on that in a minute. But let's first talk about TerminusDB. So, full disclosure, I watched a few of your presentations, scanned through the website, and for those who haven't seen any of them, one of them basically starts with Luke introducing an Excel file and saying, here's like 20 different projects that do Git for data, and they're all inferior to our stuff. So what's TerminusDB? Where do you start with that?
Yeah, so thanks, Miko. So we are a open source graph database and document store, and we're an immutable database. We kind of try to be a Git for data and also then provide a GitHub for data. So we have Terminus Hub, which operates like a GitHub for data, and the database then itself is like a Git for data. I wouldn't say the others are inferior. They're just different, and they do different things. And there's definitely, especially in machine learning operations, there's been a real proliferation of tools that like to say that they're Git for data. And it's almost become a joke. In one of those videos, I was talking at the Knowledge Graph conference recently, and I pulled out a screenshot from the MLOps Slack. And somebody had let's set up a channel called Bad Startup Ideas. And it'll be all hilarious and we'll have a joke. And one of the other participants put up something called Git for data as a terrible startup idea, because there's so many of them. There's so many of them that call themselves Git for data, because there's a huge hole. Git has had such an enormous, and, distributed revision control in general has had such an enormous impact in software development. And now as we get from the era of the lone data scientist into the era of the data engineer, when you're trying to build reliable pipelines that deliver value into business, you need something like Git to make that all happen. And so TerminusDB, is one of the types of solutions for that, that'll allow you to have versions of your data through a pipeline that you can then have dev, you can then stage to main, and exactly that we kind of try and mirror some of those Git semantics and Git processes, but in a proper database that's queryable, and where you can, query deltas, you can query diffs between different states of the database.
Okay, so many things to touch upon now. You dropped so many, casually. Open source, distributed source control, Git. You mentioned both document and some kind of schema from what I understand. So maybe let's try to decompose that a little bit for, smaller bits. So, I think it's probably arguable that the distributed kind of source control and in general, the source control modern, the way that we see it now is probably one of the biggest inventions in writing software in the recent history. And then I guess the GitHub that you also mentioned kind of adds this entire layer of socializing on top of that, the entire culture of GIFs and memes and all of that, and makes it into basically a club in a sense, right? A society rather than just the code exchange there. So when you're saying, Git for data, it kind of sounds a bit like Uber for X, right? When all of a sudden everybody had the startup idea of saying Uber for X, right?
Yeah.
When you say that, like, is most of the value that you're hoping to build in the actual data inside of the GitHub for data that you're talking about, or is it more in the tooling?
So that's a really interesting question. So what we would see is that one of the things that goes with Git as a software development system is the microservices revolution that allows distributed teams to break down complex code bases and work much more efficiently in terms of development time. And what we want to be able to do similarly in data is to allow those teams, those domain teams, to become much more efficient by working with distributed data and data products. And really, we see the value as a combination of organizational shift where you can devolve responsibility for dealing with data products out to domain teams by enabling them with technology. And revision control is an absolutely essential piece of that, because in order to trust domain teams to actually deal with the data effectively, you have to be able to roll back. And then for anybody that is operating on that, you want to be able to have, branches. And actually, we found that describing them as branches can be confusing in a data setting. And we're now talking them more like versioned graphs, that within any one database or data product, you have a series of version graphs. And those version graphs might be, they might be like dev and main, like you'd have in Git, and the main being the production one that's running some application somewhere within your enterprise or a web app. And then dev could be the dev one that you mess around with. But you could also have, version graphs like the one that has no personally identifiable information that you can surface up to the rest of the company. And you can manage that just much more effectively if it's managed in a decentralized team way. So that's really the sort of enterprise architecture that we're hoping to enable. Now, we're kind of, we're at the beginning of that journey from TerminusDB, but that's really the vision of where we create value within the enterprise. And then to kind of, maybe I'll just turn back a little bit and give a short bit of our kind of our trajectory, because we're a university spin out. We came out of Trinity College in Dublin. I'm sitting here in Dublin, Ireland right now. And we were a very large research project that was led by the European Commission, funded by them, to build the technical architecture for something called SESHAT. It's a global history data bank. So bringing all of the economic and social data sets from all of human history and then providing them in a single machine readable format so that people could do advanced analytics and looking at longue durée. So we kind of came out of that world of just really complex schema and complex collaboration amongst a lot of different people and built the software there, and then spun it out of university as that. And when we first came out, we were kind of, we were looking at large scale implementations of graph in enterprise, and now went down the more open source, more open science type of route to try and kind of, build a community around that.
Okay, so that makes perfect sense. But I'm wondering from a perspective of, someone who just kind of heard about it and wants to kick the tires, how different is it? You mentioned some of the problems with using Git and GitHub for data, like querying the revisions and stuff like that. What's the experience like? Is it more like Git or like a database? I think I saw somewhere the query language WOQL. What's that like?
So WOQL is a data log. It's like data log's been hanging around for 40 years as a query language, but it's finally now kind of coming a little bit of center stage. And there are a bunch of up and coming databases that are using WOQL, or not using WOQL, but using data logs and variants of data logs. You have databases like Datomic that people might be aware of, Kraken, OpenCrux. So there's a bunch of new up and coming databases that are using data log as a query language because it can it can just contain a lot of complexity. And as you get into lots of complex data, SQL runs out of headroom. And picking up something like data log, which Wackle is based on, that is. So we'd say it's quite SQL like, but it is obviously there's some learning to do between it and SQL. For people that are picking up the database, but we're more of a database than a Git type system. So we borrow a lot of those Git functions in order to describe things that happen in the database. But we're a proper database with a proper full query language. So you can do all the database type of things. The sorts of use cases we're focused on are more analytics at the moment than being, an operational database for the back end of a high throughput application. Just because we see a lot of problems in analytics, it's just not a solved problem. And, I won't go back to it again, but the truth is, I think for a lot of people probably listening to this, is that, the cloud data warehouse or the data lake, data swamp, they're bottlenecks that you have to go through in order to kind of solve things. So distributing things in the same way that software revision control like Git allowed you to distribute work there, like that just seems like a no-brainer to me.
It does. Although I'm still trying to picture that. So we're kind of mixing a lot of different things. You mentioned SQL, which is tables and rows and queries like that. Documents, which is, I guess, makes sense because a lot of the data natively is some kind of CSV somewhere, right, that you're going to want to do put in there. And you also mentioned graph. So I'm curious how all of these different kind of basically approaches to storing the data and working with it works in terms of discoverability of that thing. Like, what's the magic sauce now to kind of put it all together to help with the discoverability, as opposed to just, I can stick a few CSV files in Git and kind of call it a day, right?
Exactly. I mean, and people do that. We see a lot of people that are sticking CSVs on Git in order to say that's revision control. And like that probably works fine for some people. But once you kind of get into more complexity, then it just all falls apart. So for us, the big thing for us is that we've got strong data models and we give strong schema support within the database, and we version schema with code or I mean, with data. So we have versioning of both all the way down to the base. And under the hood, we're an RDF database, in fact. So, but we speak JSON to everything. So we're JSON LD over the wire. And we kind of, realize that everybody now is very comfortable in a JSON first world and a document first world. So we're shaping ourselves towards that and trying to, make it easy for coders, for programmers, for anybody there who just wants to have a document store, be able to use our database in the way that they like and not have to go through elaborate building of schema up front, but be able to do that a little bit later on into your project when you have a greater idea of where you're going.
Sure. You mentioned under the hood, which gets me curious. Can you talk a bit how it's implemented? What is under the hood? What technologies, languages, and all of that? A quick, flyover tour.
It's slightly peculiar and speaks to our background because when we came out of university, we come from the linked data community initially. And so our database is implemented in Rust at the storage layer. So the distributed storage layer, so the Git-like stuff is built in Rust. And then the query layer is built in Prolog, which is a logical programming language from the 1970s as well, which isn't very popular with coders these days. But we kind of have the trendiest and the hottest language as our storage layer, which is Rust, and then one of the least popular languages of all as our server layer. So it's really, really strong on query. So therefore, we found it quick to develop in, quick to find the sorts of functionality that we want. Yeah, so kind of that's our base layer. We implemented the database from the ground up, both the storage engine and the query. We don't really have anybody else's technologies in there, though now we are definitely starting to build out more links within the ETL ecosystem and things like that. So the externalities of the database are better served. My advice to all the listeners is don't try and build a database yourself. It's crazy. It's a terrible idea. It takes
right, which is which is a perfect segue to open source. So, how easy is it to get open source contributions to Prolog?
Really
And
hard. Yeah, that's hard. I mean, we get them. So the place that we mostly get them is into the client. We have a Python client, and we have quite an active community around developing that and helping with that. Obviously, the Python community is particularly good at open source, and then the Rust community as well. So Rust obviously isn't that well known, though it is popular. So there's not that many people who have a very deep knowledge, but people do participate and contribute to the Rust code base because they want to learn Rust and they want to kind of be involved in projects around Rust. So definitely we find it there, but Prolog, very, very few outside contributors, though there is a committed community of people that know Prolog and they have contributed. We've had an interesting journey in open source insofar as we started as GPL 3 and we switched our code base over to Apache 2.0 because we had a lot of people in the community that wanted to embed the database into applications and things like that, and they were worried about the copyleft aspects of the GPL. Even though I don't think it's really that significant a concern, and they weren't really engaging in any practices that would have caused them any concern, there's just a general feeling that there's something bad there. Yeah. And so we switched over to Apache, and that's been great. We have a kind of active community of contributors. Again, though, to go back to under the hood, we also use something called succinct data structures. So they allow us to approach the theoretical minimum size of data that can still be queried. So they're quite new and interesting data structures. And we use those so that we can kind of facilitate the collaboration features because we want to be able to share deltas efficiently so that we can send a delta to somebody else. So it has to be very small. And so we use those. But again, there's just not a lot of people that know that. The expectation that we're going to get people contributing code to the core of the database is relatively limited. But then on the fringes, in the JavaScript client, in the Python client, we do get plenty of people participating. And open source is great, the vibrancy of the community is fantastic.
Yeah, and a lot of people say that the open source is eating the software world now, and I definitely see more and more of this technologies being used all over the place now. And even on this podcast, we're seeing more and more companies jump into the open source first model and kind of, just work around that for the actual business model. I also noticed that you have very kind of strong commitments on your website. It's like now and forever open source. I was wondering if that was like a dig against like the don't sass me kind of wave of changes in licenses recently.
Yeah,
okay. I think that left
You're right.
It tells
it's
me.
It's a dig against MongoDB mostly. Mongo, Elastic, all of these guys, basically leaving open source after Fed. I mean, I kind of understand their reasons because, AWS and these other guys are, launching DocumentDB and trying to come into their space. But They were built by the open source community, and then turning around and saying, well, we're not open source anymore when we're, a $5 billion business because it's not enough of profit. Seems to me from where we're standing that those companies are enormously successful and that they should remain committed to open source even in the face of competition. So it's forever. Yeah. Even though we will launch a cloud platform as well, but we'll stay open source with the core database forever.
Awesome. So for everybody who's tuned in so far and their interest got picked, I know I certainly am interested. How do you get started with that? What's the best way to kind of go kick the tires, test it with some data? Because with the data stuff, you need some data to to actually play with. Do you have like a sandbox environment where people play or some kind of tutorial that introduces what's the, one-on-one?
Yeah, so we have a bunch of tutorials with a bunch of data associated with them. And obviously the database can be downloaded directly from our website. And we have a Discord community that, can point everybody in the right direction of the various different tutorials with various different bits of cool data. We are about to drop a cloud data platform, which will have a kind of sandbox and a trial and have all of the nice, easy to use, easy to extract data in it for people to mess around with.
Awesome. So TerminusDB.com, that's where you go?
TerminusDB.com. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And then we have our Discord community, which is really where we do most of our kind of chatting. I mean, we were on Slack and we've moved across to Discord and we just like it way more. I have to say. The gamers design things in a much more ergonomic way.
Definitely. Big fan of Discord. Also big fan of the pricing model.
Yeah.
By comparison. Okay. Awesome. So I can't wait anymore. Tell me about the diplomat. Yeah, I've never seen anyone move from politics to tech. Seen a few people move the other way around. What happened? What attracted you? Were you in tech at the same time, or did you completely switch and change? Because you felt like doing a change.
Yeah, completely switched and changed. So I was a diplomat for the Irish government for 13 years. I was in the embassy in South Africa and the embassy in Greece. I served in the United Nations in New York for a while. And then I came back to Dublin after spending 4 years in Greece. And it was a great time in Greece because I was there through an economic crisis and a refugee crisis. It was a really interesting time to be in that part of the world. And Greece is just a fantastic country, full stop. And we also looked after some of the countries in that part of the world. So we were responsible for Serbia and Albania. So we travel a lot on the Balkan Peninsula. And then I did a year and a bit as the head of the government's Brexit communications. And,
Oh dear.
during the middle of Brexit, and it's a very intense period. So an opportunity presented itself to take a jump across into tech. And I thought this seems like something interesting to do. When I arrived then, I immediately regretted it in a sense because you land and everybody is saying Kubernetes and Docker and Terraform and this next buzzword, and you feel immediately lost in a world that seems so alien. In diplomacy is sales, like everything. Everything is sales. It's all about selling something. In that case, you're selling Ireland or selling an idea, and again, then you're kind of back into trying to understand something so that you can explain it effectively to somebody else. And really, that's what I tried to do when I came into tech, is try and get a decent understanding of the way things work together, and then try and explain it back to people.
All right.
But yeah,
So
I mean, it's been a crazy transition when I think back, how different the worlds are. The beauty of startups is that it's a very relaxed and open environment where people are willing to learn and to share. And that's very different from working in a diplomatic system, especially when you're abroad and there's a lot more cards much closer to the chest about who knows what and what are secrets, what are open. And really, tech isn't really like that. I mean, it's a very welcoming and a positive learning community most of the time. I mean, obviously there are dark underbellies to that as well, but there's just a lot of people who want to learn and want to be positive about learning, and that's great.
most of the time.
Most of the time. Yeah, most of the time.
Definitely. Yeah. So basically moved from selling Ireland to selling tech now.
Yeah, exactly.
And sounds like you wish the diplomacy was a bit more open. Is there anything that you wish tech was more like diplomacy is in the other direction?
Well, that's a difficult question now. I suppose that like tech probably is like diplomacy in a sense. I mean, when you get like a lot of these very big corporates like Amazon and Apple, and they get to the scale of being, as large as states. I mean, obviously,
Yeah.
you got a $2 trillion market capitalization for Apple, and it has all of those branches associated with it, like public affairs or public policy, who are effectively diplomats for those very large tech companies who are trying to shift public policy to make it more amenable to those corporate concerns. So, big tech companies and the biggest ones have their own diplomatic services out there doing diplomatic things. But what would I take with me? There's within the diplomatic service itself, there's an incredible collegiality. There's a very, very, very strong team spirit within there. You might be presented with other diplomatic services who might have other aims, but on your own team, on the inside, there's a very, very strong support structure that does feel like family. And I miss that. I do miss that, working in a small organization, that you can never quite recreate that sort of family feeling within a large organization like that.
That makes sense. Although I gotta say, an idea of being a diplomat in Athens sounds pretty damn attractive, especially right now.
Yeah, it was. It was an amazing time because if you think back, it was Yanis Varoufakis, it was
Yep.
Syriza, it was Tsipras, it was all of these kind of larger than life figures emerging onto the scene, and you're right there in the front row, seeing all this happen and reporting back on it. So, fascinating, really fascinating time to be there.
Yeah. And yeah, you're calling this a fascinating time going through all the crises, including the Brexit one. I'm guessing you really experienced a lot of one in a lifetime events this way.
Yeah, well, the Brexit one was different for me because I was, looking after communications, and I suppose it's like, for anybody who's working in startup or in tech, it's like the day you announce your 50 million Series A or Series B, but every day is like that in terms of the intensity of communications work because Ireland was so central to it. And
Right.
so many international journalists were interested in Ireland's perspective on Brexit. So you just had this constant flow of the media spotlight being on Ireland and on your office and trying to coordinate that across a system of 35,000 civil servants is very challenging. So it was just a very intense period. And, I think it was very successful from Ireland's perspective. We managed to explain our position very well. I think that kind of got out there. And, Britain's gone totally nutty since Brexit as well. It remains kind of a little bit nutty.
Yeah. And I think that's probably where we should leave that. So people have very strong opinions on this stuff. Okay, so to shift gears a little bit, because we're almost out of time, I'm curious, out of your very unique kind of career path, if you were to pinpoint a single one thing that you did that provided the highest return on investment for your career. And it can be anything from a book you read to a course you attended to the meditation technique you tried out. What would it be?
Yeah, that's an interesting one again. I mean, it's a difficult thing. Now, I have 4 young children. So I have to say that they're obviously the most positive thing that happened in a sense because they provide me with incredible grounding. And no matter what's going on in terms of everything collapsing or everything being incredibly difficult, and they give me great grounding into, just being their father and being, shouted at for whatever else is going on in their lives. But I'd say one of the things that I've started to do recently because of seeing all of these Silicon Valley kind of bros talking about it is regulating my sleep to a very great degree. So going to bed at the same time every single night and regulating it to a very great degree. And that's just been transformational in terms of my daily ability to be productive. And I, it seems so foundational and so simple, but previously I would have been up working till 2 a.m. or 1 a.m. Or doing something else. And changing that's just allowed me to be much more productive. In terms of a book, geez, I don't know. That's a hard one. There's so many great books out there. I really, when I came into tech, and I wonder if other people will know this, but I read the Phoenix Project, which is like this novel that's based around an IT department that's going through digital transformation and kind of implementing microservices type architecture. But it's written in novel format, like it's a story about a guy who is the head of IT within a corporation that's got a terrible IT department and treats the developers very badly, and how through his story he kind of gives rebirth to the company. That's amazing. I really enjoyed that.
Awesome. So much good stuff. So kids, when you listen to that 10 years from now, that's proud. And remember, he did good. And the sleep thing is also interestingly something that I kind of struggled for a long time with. And only recently, during the pandemic, I was kind of forced to regulate that too. And I really saw a big improvement just from, getting tired at the same time and going to sleep at the same time. And then, crazy things like waking up without the alarm. So I can definitely share support for that idea. This really has been great. Thank you so much for your time, Luke. I think we learned quite a lot interesting stuff about unusual kind of database slash git slash something that TerminusDB seems to be. Learned a little bit about how being a deployment is for Ireland specifically, and got some good book recommendations. So Luke Feeney, CCO at TerminusDB, and thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Miko. It was a real pleasure.